on our nation's economy. At the outset, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time without objection so ordered. Before I begin, I'd like to welcome the newest member of the Budget Committee representing Utah's 1st District, Blake Moore. Blake, I heard you're a father of 4, so perhaps it's fitting that the first hearing on the Budget Committee is about the investments we should make in our nation's children. We welcome you, and the committee's happy to have you here. Now I will start by going over a few housekeeping matters. The committee is holding a hybrid hearing. Members may participate remotely or in person. For individuals participating remotely, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute a participant's microphone when the participant is not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. If you are participating remotely and are experiencing connectivity issues, please contact staff immediately so those issues can be resolved. Members participating in the hearing room or on the remote platform are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition. We are not permitted to unmute members unless they explicitly request assistance. If you are participating remotely and I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask if you would like staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. They will not unmute your microphone under any other conditions. I'd like to remind members participating remotely in this proceeding to keep your camera on at all times, even if you are not under recognition by the chair. Members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. If you are on a remote platform and choose to participate in a different proceeding, please turn your camera off. Finally, we have established an inbox for submitting documents before and during committee proceedings, and we have distributed that email address to your staff. Now I will introduce our witnesses. This morning we will be hearing from Dr. Maureen Black, a distinguished fellow in early childhood development, RTI International, and a professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Mr. Rashid Malik, the Senior Director for Early Childhood Policy at the Center for American Progress, and the Honorable Newt Gingrich, the former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. This time, I'd like to recognize Ms. Lee to introduce our final panel. Oh, she's on the phone. Well, we're gonna. Do you want Ms. Lee to represent her, to recognize and introduce her constituent? She's on the phone. Well, when she comes back, we'll let her introduce the Dr. Hoynes, who is our 4th witness. Once again, I want to recognize and to welcome all of our witnesses here today. Thank you for joining us. And I will now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning. I want to welcome our witnesses and thank them for appearing before our committee today. One of our witnesses is a notable veteran of this chamber, Speaker Gingrich. We are glad to have you back with us. This hearing is about the importance of investing in our nation's children. It should be a concern to everyone on this committee that while the U.S. is the wealthiest nation in the world, we are among the stingiest nations when it comes to funding for our children. And it shows. Despite having the highest rated education system in the world, U.S. students consistently score lower in math and science than students from many other countries. It's no coincidence that just as U.S. education rankings have decreased by international standards over the past 3 decades, so have our federal investments in children. While the American Rescue Plan and recent appropriations bills have helped to reverse this troubling trend, there's much, much more work to be done. Supporting our youngest Americans is one of the most concrete ways we can set our nation up for success. We call these programs investments because they pay off, literally, for children, for their families, for our society, and for our economy. For example, participation in the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, more commonly known as WIC, leads to fewer premature births, fewer infant deaths, and healthier babies. WIC saves lives, but it also pays other dividends. For every dollar spent, WIC also results in approximately $2.48 in reduced medical costs and productivity gains. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, not only provides healthy food to 44 million children, it also gives an important boost to local communities during downturns. Each SNAP dollar generates more than $1.70 of economic activity, supporting jobs and local businesses. Tax policies have also proven successful in reducing poverty while generating enormous returns for local economies. The expanded child tax credit, which Democrats enacted last year as part of the American Rescue Plan and did so without a single Republican vote, lifted 3.7 million children out of poverty in 2021 alone. Another investment that generates enormous returns for kids and for our economy is childcare. Study after study has found that enrollment in high-quality programs improves kids' school readiness, college attendance, and health outcomes, and reduces their likelihood of future criminal activity. Access to childcare clearly can have long-lasting positive impacts, but it remains far too expensive and for far too many American families. In fact, the cost of childcare has doubled in the past 30 years, while real wages have remained nearly flat. This puts many parents in the position of having to stay at home to care for their children when they would prefer to be working and building a stronger economic future for their families. As a result, the lack of affordable childcare leads to economic losses between $500 million and $3.5 billion in each state every year. This is an area where we can make an enormous impact for American families. We know the problem, we know the solution. What we are lacking is the bipartisan support needed to get it done. This would be a typical problem in a closely divided Congress, but this is no longer a typical time in the political history of the United States. Everything changed on June 24th when the Supreme Court ruled in Dobbs v. Jackson. Roe v. Wade is no longer the law of the land. This is what Republicans have long sought and fought tooth and nail for. But now what? They celebrated the Dobbs decision, but they want to cut programs that help women afford the care needed to have a safe pregnancy, birth, and postpartum recovery. If given the chance, Republicans would defund Medicaid, SNAP, TANF, and other programs that help mothers and children stay healthy and keep them from going hungry. They have no plan for our child care crisis that will now undoubtedly get worse. Republicans want to cut education funding when schools will need more. If every life were truly sacred in this country, we wouldn't be having a hearing about programs to keep mothers and their children healthy, fed, and cared for. We'd be fully funding them. The thing is, we know these policies work. We know how critical these investments are for the health of our children, the health of our society, and the health of our economy. And now we know we will need them even more. Investing in our children is the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do, and it's the most important investment we can make in the future of our country. With that, I'd like to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes. 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to welcome our newest member, Blake Moore, to the committee. We're excited to have you. Democrats and Republicans can both agree a focus on early childhood development is very important. But I find it very curious that this committee, which greenlit $2 trillion in spending last year and sparked the worst inflation in 40 years, is not using its time to examine the country's current situation. America is on the brink of a recession, which would do more harm to families than anything else we could be discussing. Inflation has risen 13.8% since Joe Biden took the oath of office. That means families are spending more money on clothes for their kids and food to feed them. Our economy shrank 1.6% first quarter of this year, and current forecast shows that this quarter it shrank again. 25% of Americans are reportedly postponing their retirement because of financial concerns. The average family will spend over $5,000 more this year just to make ends meet. The labor force participation is also down, and we still have over 11 million job openings, due in part to the Democrats' decision last year to remove work requirements from the child tax credit. The Federal Reserve has raised interest rates at the fastest rate in 40 years to combat Biden's inflation crisis. The rate on a 30-year fixed mortgage is now double than what it was before Joe Biden took the oath of office. The biggest threat to families right now is not a lack of government spending. We are in a state of crisis precisely of reckless government spending. None of this happened by accident. Washington Democrats They purposely dumped trillions into the economy. They paid people not to work, and they strangled American fossil fuels. And congressional Democrats are bound and determined to make the economic pain and suffering even worse. Using reconciliation instructions this committee passed last September, Senate Democrats are reviving a Build Back Broke agenda that would spend hundreds of billions more and raise taxes by as much as $1 trillion. Raising taxes when the economy is in or headed toward a recession is a horrible idea. Janet Yellen, Barack Obama, Joe Manchin, and Chuck Schumer have all previously said as much, and yet that's what Democrats are trying to do to this country. A looming recession brought on by the reckless economic policies of this administration and one-party Democrat rule in Washington would be particularly painful for the parents and kids this hearing is supposedly focused on. Looking at the most recent recession from 2007 to 2009, we lost 9 million jobs. 10 million people fell into poverty, including 3 million children. We can't just ignore this problem and hope that it's going to go away. But turning back to the topic of this hearing, let's look at what our Democrat colleagues have actually proposed. The Congressional Budget Office confirmed the child care subsidies in their Build Back Broke agenda will actually raise costs for middle-class families. On top of that, the Democrats' plan specifically excludes faith-based providers that millions of families rely on for care. Under their plan, federal funding scales back, leaving states on the hook for almost half the cost within 7 years. Their plan would require states and grantees to have childcare and pre-K programs approved by the HHS secretary. This is the same secretary who let teachers' unions edit CDC guidelines to keep schools shut down last year. Meanwhile, the president's Department of Education is threatening schools that don't use the right gender pronouns or let biological men compete in girls' sports. We should be focused on the things that will directly affect Americans today, like avoiding tax increases on families and small businesses and halting inflationary spending that is making it hard for folks to afford the basic necessities needed to raise their kids. We need pro-growth policies that put families on solid ground, and when it comes to childcare and education, we need to keep the decision-making local. Stop trying to impose a Washington knows best approach. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mike's not on. Anyway, I want to thank the witnesses once again for being here. The committee has received your written statements and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. You each will have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks, and I would now like to recognize Ms. Lee to introduce our first witness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. First of all, let me just thank you for this hearing and just say how excited I am and to welcome one of my constituents from Berkeley today, Dr. Hilary Hoynes, who's a professor of economics and public policy and the Haas Distinguished Chair in Economic Disparities at UC Berkeley, which of course is my alma mater. I have to just say, go Bears. Thank you so much for being here. Her research focuses on poverty, inequality, food and nutrition programs, the impact of government tax and transfer programs on low-income families. Also, let me just say, she serves on the National Academy of Sciences Committee on building an agenda to reduce childhood poverty in half in 10 years, and on many more important boards and commissions and committees. And of course, I want to thank her for being here today, but also thank her for her expertise on these issues, especially on reducing child poverty in half in 10 years. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. And I now recognize Dr. Hoynes. You may unmute your microphone and begin when you are ready. You have 5 minutes.
Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to appear before you today at this hearing on investments in early childhood. My name is Hilary Hoynes. I'm a professor of economics and public policy at the University of California, Berkeley, where I also hold the Haas Distinguished Chair in Economic Disparities. My testimony today summarizes evidence that the social safety net for children generates widespread benefits over the longer term, both to children and their families, and to taxpayers and the broader economy. In 2019, after a robust economic recovery, 9 million American children remained poor. The risk of child poverty is not equal across the population. Black and Hispanic children are more likely to be poor than white children. Children living with one or no biological parent and children living with less educated parents have higher poverty rates. The costs of child poverty extend beyond families to the broader economy. This occurs because child poverty leads to lower education levels and worse health, and therefore less tax revenue and more spending in the future. The National Academy's report, Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty, to which I contributed, concluded that the costs of child poverty ranged from $800 billion to $1.1 trillion each year. The current social safety net, however, does reduce child poverty. The Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, and the Child Tax Credit reduce child poverty by 5.9 percentage points. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, reduces poverty by 5.2 percentage points. Cash welfare raises few children out of poverty. Furthermore, and importantly, recent social science research documents that safety net spending on children leads to improvements in economic and health outcomes in adulthood. My research shows that SNAP improves long-run outcomes. Access to SNAP during pregnancy leads to healthier births. Access to SNAP during childhood leads to better adult health, increases in education, earnings, neighborhood quality, and home ownership, and decreases in poverty, mortality, and incarceration. Other safety net programs show similar results. Access to the EITC during pregnancy leads to healthier births. Access to the EITC during childhood leads to improved performance in school, increases in education, employment, and earnings, and for women, less engagement with the criminal justice system. Access to Medicaid for pregnant women and children leads to improved health outcomes, better performance in school, and increases in educational attainment and earnings in adulthood. Overall, the research establishes that additional resources for low-income children generate improvements across a wide range of adult outcomes. These findings can be used to quantify the benefits relative to the costs of these policies. The costs include the benefit payments themselves and administrative costs, as well as indirect costs coming from changes in employment that result from delivering the benefits and the taxes to fund them. Combining these costs and benefits yield large rates of return across these programs. For SNAP, providing benefits to children yields $56 of benefits to families for every dollar of net costs. For the Earned Income Tax Credit, taking into account the long-run benefits, the program fully pays for itself in the long run. Medicaid for pregnant women and infants fully pays for itself in the long run. Taking into account the long-run benefits, the 2021 expansion of the Child Tax Credit is estimated to reduce the net cost to taxpayers to 16 cents for every dollar of new benefits. So these results show that spending more now means spending less later. Higher adult earnings mean higher future tax revenue. Improved health and reductions in criminal activity mean lower future government spending. It is important to point out, however, that costs are easy to quantify and are incurred early at the time of program delivery. Benefits, on the other hand, take time to emerge. This is particularly problematic because the CBO scores policy proposals over a 10-year window. This disregards long-term benefits and can lead to short-term thinking, ignoring the investment aspect of these programs. In sum, the social safety net for families with children represents investments in the human capital of children, not simply transfers to adults. The returns to these investments, like that of infrastructure, require spending up front, but yield important benefits in the future. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Hoynes, for that testimony. I now recognize Dr. Black for 5 minutes. Unmute your microphone and proceed.
Chairman Yarmuth, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to meet with you today to discuss the powerful impact of investment in early childhood. My name is Maureen Black. I am a distinguished fellow at RTI International and a professor in pediatrics at the University of Maryland in Baltimore. For over 25 years, I have been a licensed child psychologist, and I have directed an interdisciplinary clinic for young children with growth and/or feeding problems. I have also served on advisory boards for Maryland WIC, Maryland Hunger Solutions, and Children's Health Watch, a nonpartisan network of healthcare providers committed to improving children's health. My testimony addresses the conditions necessary for young children to thrive, which is foundational to the health, productivity, and well-being of adults and society, and in particular, how WIC has contributed to children thriving. My testimony is based on my clinical experiences as well as research that I have conducted or reviewed. In 2020, WIC served about 6.2 million participants per month, or almost half of all infants born in the U.S. I have submitted a complete testimony for the record. I will summarize 6 points that highlight WIC's contribution to equity and to American children thriving. First, WIC is based on the science of early childhood and is tightly focused on the most critical period of human development, the first 5 years. Basic brain development during this period is rapid, with specific nutritional requirements, such as breast milk. Adversities during this period can have long-term negative effects on adult health, including diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and other non-communicable diseases. Interventions during this period provide the greatest potential for children to thrive. By ensuring that children have nutritious food and responsive caregiving, WIC helps children build healthy habits that last throughout life. Second, WIC promotes equity with a positive impact on the health and development of children in low-income families. Third, as the chairman has noted, the economic evaluations find that every dollar spent per WIC participant saves $2.48 in medical costs. Fourth, WIC brings resources into communities through retailers and the WIC Farmers Market Nutrition Program. Fifth, WIC is dynamic in responding to external stressors such as children's excess weight gain, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the recent infant formula shortage. Finally, WIC works. Expectant WIC participating mothers have healthy babies with reductions in preterm birth and low birth weight and increases in breastfeeding. For children, WIC promotes responsive caregiving and healthy dietary patterns that are associated with reduction in obesity and benefits in school performance. Based on these 6 points, WIC is a cost-effective public health program that improves the human condition by ensuring that infants are born healthy and that young children thrive and contribute to the larger society as they become healthy, well-adjusted, productive adults. Looking forward, WIC is well-positioned to implement system-level changes, including expanding access to WIC services and leveraging data sharing with healthcare providers that will reduce barriers and better serve existing and future WIC participants. These innovations will enable WIC to continue to effectively utilize taxpayer dollars and ensure that all American children can thrive. I thank the committee and the Congress for making these life-changing investments in women, infants, and children of our nation. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Black. I now recognize Mr. Malik for 5 minutes. Unmute, please, and proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee. I'd like to also thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. My name is Rashid Malik, and I am the Senior Director of Early Childhood Policy at the Center for American Progress. I'd like to start with a quote from Nelson Mandela, who once said, "Our children are the rock on which our future will be built, our greatest asset as a nation. They will be the leaders of our country, the creators of our national wealth, those who care for and protect our people." Now, I don't believe that anyone here would disagree with this statement. In fact, I've heard countless variations on it from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. A genuine concern for the healthy development and education of our children is one of our clearest shared values as a society, and it is great to see this reflected by our representatives in government. But when it comes to making commitments in the federal budget towards evidence-based early childhood policies, we have fallen short as a nation. The United States invests a smaller percentage of our GDP in childcare and early education than almost every other developed economy in the world. While the benefits from high-quality childcare have been studied for years by economists and other social scientists, little public funding has followed. In many places, a year of childcare costs more than a year of college tuition, and that's if you can find an opening for your child. Across the country, wait lists for childcare are longer than ever. And the global pandemic has worsened the childcare crisis, let me be clear. 1 in 10 early educators have still not returned to the field, and turnover is at an all-time high. The numbers just don't work for childcare businesses. They can't pay their teachers any less, and they can't charge parents any more. This funding gap is begging for a public investment so that supply can meet demand. Without it, we will continue to have educator shortages, diminished maternal labor force attachment, and ever-widening inequality of child outcomes. The silver lining in all this is that these conditions present us with an historic opportunity to dramatically improve conditions for children, their families, and early childhood educators. When we put public dollars behind early childhood programs, we're investing in long-term cost savers that help pay for themselves in the form of higher tax revenues and increased productivity. Investments in the childcare sector both create jobs and enable job growth in other sectors of the economy. It's why now more than ever, business leaders are pointing to childcare as key to hiring and retaining working mothers. Now, recently, Harvard University economist Nathaniel Hendren and his colleague Ben Sprung-Kaiser undertook a comparative analysis of more than 130 public policy interventions, all conducted over the last 50 years in the United States. And the question they sought to answer was, deceptively simple, which policies improve social well-being the most? By looking at the benefits of each policy towards its intended audience, as well as the policy's net cost, these scholars have published a groundbreaking study that answers that very question. The metric they've developed to compare various policies is called the marginal value of public funds. It's just the kind of thing that responsible policymakers have been asking for. And what policies improve social well-being the most? What is the best use of public funds? Direct investments in the health and well-being of low-income children. According to their math, several of the early childhood policies they looked at had the highest possible score, meaning that the policy didn't even have a net cost to the government. Put another way, on top of the benefits received by the children that were targeted, these programs literally paid for themselves through increased tax revenue and reduced transfer payments. Now, as Dr. Hoynes has written about extensively, the body of policy research has historically been focused on short-run benefits. This has discounted and shortchanged children, their families, and those who care for and educate our youngest babies and children. The work of educating and caring for young children has been systematically undervalued for far too long because of this bias in our analytical framework. This committee is taking an important first step today by acknowledging these historical misconceptions, and in the future, I hope that Congress will move away from short-sighted policy concerns. President Biden likes to say, "Don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value." And for a long time in this country, there's been a significant divergence between our stated values and our public budgets. It's my hope that this hearing can be a step in the direction of reconciling that imbalance. Thank you again for inviting me to this hearing, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Malik, for your testimony. And now have an honor of introducing former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. Mr. Gingrich, you have 5 minutes. Begin when you're ready.
Well, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Smith and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you. I'm honored to return even virtually to the People's House. This committee is dealing with some of the most important issues facing our country, and it has the great opportunity to begin restoring an America that works for all Americans. Your topic today, however, raises two questions. One, does more spending in a period of rampant inflation actually make the inflation worse and cost more to the American families you're trying to help? And two, is government an effective delivery system? You know, it's a great irony to have the government, which has been the largest single abuser of children of the last 2 years, suggest that Americans should trust government to improve their children's lives and futures. The government-led efforts to isolate and mistreat children in response to COVID-19, to trap them in schools that don't teach, and to eliminate the culture of work, productivity, and hope for a better future have contributed to widespread psychological and academic trauma to children that we've never really seen before. The government's failure to deal with mental health issues in a serious way that prioritizes patient and community welfare has led to a record number of people who are homeless. The government's failure to stop the illegal drug trade and the explosion of overdoses and deaths and suicides has led to more American deaths than the last several wars combined. It's also been the largest single destructive force undermining and weakening children in American history. But there are several things your committee could be doing to repair some of the damage. As President Ronald Reagan said, the greatest social program is a job. Work is good for the family, it's good for income, and it's good for teaching young people that when they grow up, they should expect to work. Second, we balanced the federal budget for 4 straight years through a bipartisan effort. And the fact is that the Clinton-Gingrich budgets worked. They reduced the inflation rate, they reduced the tax rate, they created jobs, because we cared about America's future enough to make tough choices now. Third, given the current rate of inflation, the idea we ought to pile more money into the system is an almost suicidal act of hubris. Fourth, when we passed welfare reform, it was principled, work-oriented, a system-wide overhaul, and it worked. It worked because people went to work. Because Americans were going to work, we saw the largest single reduction of childhood poverty in American history. And the reforms were bipartisan. Perhaps most importantly, the ideas and work that led to successful welfare reform didn't come solely out of Washington, D.C. We reached out to governors and state officials who actually ran the welfare programs. They told us what needed to be fixed and what needed to be completely reworked. We didn't tell them. This, of course, drove the Washington, D.C. staff members crazy, but it worked. We needed to hear from the people who actually worked in these programs on a day-to-day basis to understand how the system needed to change. The greatest problem Washington has today is its inability to learn what works and what fails in the real world. This city has a passion for skipping over reality and focusing on ideology. And we're seeing it happen today as we grapple with high inflation and stumble toward a recession. We don't have to reinvent the world of Jimmy Carter. We know what works. What works is balancing the budget. What works is having the maximum number of able-bodied Americans going to work. We should be connecting all government aid to work except for the most severely challenged. Further, given advances in technology and communication, we should reassess and update what able-bodied means. What works is cutting out corruption and incompetence. Consider the $20 billion stolen from the California Unemployment Fund. Some estimates suggest that nearly half of all pandemic aid was stolen. Simply having the committee figure out how to eliminate the theft would give you more than enough money for virtually every program you favor. What works is having strong families who have enough take-home pay to make their own decisions about how their children are educated. and who is taking care of them. Just as we need education freedom, which former Secretary Betsy DeVos is championing, we need childcare freedom. Let me say in closing, I don't believe a unionized, bureaucratic, anti-religious, one-size-fits-all government system is the answer to the future. I think what we need is to liberate the American people, to increase their take-home pay, to have an economy that is working, to control inflation so people can afford to do things, and to maximize the range of choices people have, whether it's relatives taking care of children, communities taking care of children, religious organizations taking care of children, or professional institutions taking care of children. What we don't need is a government-dominated, Washington-centered system of, once again, trying to impose big government socialism in the whole country, this time in the name of taking over our children. Thank you very much for letting me comment.
Thank you, Speaker Gingrich, for your testimony. We'll now begin our question and answer session. As a reminder, members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and responses will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so by sending them electronically to the email inbox we have established within 7 days of the hearing. I will defer my questioning to the end, as is my habit, and I will now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panelists, for being here. First of all, let me say that infants had nothing to do with the rate of inflation in America today. Every advanced economy shows that with the expansion of its population, economies are stronger and more stable, creating more opportunities for people. What's true in America today is that 10,000 kids are born every single day. That's 3,650,000 kids each year. Sadly, 22,000 infants die from birth to age 1 in America each year. America ranks 33 out of 36 advanced economies in infant deaths. Where's the pro-life outrage? Where's the pro-life outrage? Infants, maternal mortality, the pregnancy related to death of a woman during pregnancy or within 1 year of the end of that pregnancy. The United States is the only industrialized nation in the world where maternal mortality, maternal deaths, maternal morbidity is rising, not declining. The United States has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world. Each year, 900 American women die during pregnancy from the child being born to 1 year attributed to complications from. Where's the pro-life outrage in the face of these statistics? States with the strongest anti-abortion laws have the highest maternal and infant mortality rates. The strictest, the abortion law, the highest, the mom and infant deaths. Where's the pro-life outrage? Louisiana has the highest maternal deaths in America during pregnancy. Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Indiana, Ohio are among the top 10 states with the most restrictive reproductive policies in America. They're among the highest in terms of infant and maternal morbidity. Where's the pro-life outrage? Dr. Black, can you answer the question, where is the pro-life outrage in the face of these statistics that are verifiable empirically by reliable sources as it relates to infant and maternal morbidity in America?
Thank you, Representative, for your question. What I would say is that we know that programs such as WIC are very effective in reducing preterm births, in reducing low birth weight, and ensuring that mothers and infants are healthy at delivery. and also in reducing infant mortality. So having the services that WIC provides, and they provide nutrition services, which are targeted towards women during pregnancy and toward infants early in life, enable infants to develop well and prevent the catastrophes that you have described, which are clearly an American tragedy. So what we would like is increased availability of WIC to ensure that the women and infants who are eligible for WIC, and those are low-income families throughout our country, to ensure that those who are eligible have access to services. The other thing that WIC provides is not just food, but they also provide counseling, and they provide education. It is very complicated to know what are the proper foods during the times of pregnancy and very, very early in infancy. And so WIC helps families build healthy habits. The kinds of habits that they help families build remain with children throughout life. And so their habits, not only what food to eat, but how to eat, when to eat, so that we don't eat in terms of stress, but we eat to keep us healthy. They also provide referrals so that when related to lead or iron deficiency, they provide referrals. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Black. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now I yield 10 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These questions are for Speaker Gingrich. Inflation is up 13.8% since Biden took office. Real wages are down 5.1%. The economy shrank by 1.6% last quarter, and economists are predicting a recession. The Federal Reserve has raised interest rates at the fastest pace in 40 years to combat Biden's inflation crisis. The rate on a 30-year mortgage has doubled since Biden became president, and we expect the Fed will raise rates again at the end of this month. How is the current economy and Democrats' failure to address it affecting American families?
You know, thank you, first of all, both for the invitation to be here and for that, I think, very important question. I think the thing which most surprises me, and as all of you know, I've been around a long time and have been involved in this process of self-government going back to the 1970s. And as a Georgian, I had watched Jimmy Carter as governor, and then I worked with him when he was president, and I finally became congressman. What amazes me is the inability of some people, mostly on the left, to learn any lessons of history. Now, maybe that's because I'm a historian, but we know what causes inflation. Inflation is too much paper money chasing too few goods and services. We've been down this road before. The Carter years were a nightmare. We also know, by the way, what that does to families, what it does to children. It's one of the most deadly things that can happen, because when the Federal Reserve tries to stop inflation using a demand side approach, which is punishing people by cutting demand, you end up in a recession. So now you have families who don't have a job, are using up all their savings. As one woman said, she couldn't afford to pay for the gasoline to go to the 4 or 5 stores to find the infant formula. Now, that's sort of a multiple whammy, and I think your point is exactly right. The Budget Committee should be looking at how to control spending. It should be looking at how to get it. The level of corruption in federal government spending is so breathtaking that it would fund every single dream that the left has if they just could get rid of the corruption. And yet there are no serious efforts to do that. At the same time, you have to set priorities. When we worked with President Clinton, it was a bipartisan effort. He and I met, I think, for 35 days, hammering out a real balanced budget, the only 4 real balanced budgets in your lifetime. We understood we had to make tough choices, but here's a simple formula. You either force the American family to make tough choices because their politicians don't have the guts to solve problems, or you make the government have tough choices to liberate the American family. I think you're exactly on target. I can't imagine a dumber moment to increase federal spending than in the middle of an inflationary crisis.
Mr. Speaker, to follow on that, the Build Back Better bill that sits over in the Senate right now was greenlit by Democrats on this committee. It spent over $5 trillion and would have increased taxes by $1.5 trillion, and it would have added $3 trillion to the debt. And while the Democrats continue to try and bring this bill back from the dead, where would the country and the economy be right now had Democrats succeeded in enacting that additional level of $5 trillion in spending?
Well, let me go back to this idea that it's so hard to get some people to learn anything. We were at 1.4% inflation at the end of the Trump administration. We were at a dramatically lower price of gasoline. In fact, a lower price than President Obama had said was possible. We were energy independent. Now, these things weren't accidents. We were also locking up criminals, and we were controlling the southern border. None of these things were accidents. So to your point, I've always said that Build Back Poorer would be a much more accurate title for that bill, because what it's going to do is it's going to lower the net take-home pay of individuals. And by the way, one of the groups, this is a hearing about children, but one of the groups that's really being hammered by inflation are senior citizens. If you're on a fixed income and you're going to get, say, a 4 or 5% cost of living increase, but the real cost of living, as you pointed out, has gone up over 13% while Biden was president, you are losing ground. If you also are in the middle of a declining stock market, you're watching your 401k shrink at the very time that you need it because you can't afford the inflation. You can't, in a lot of cases, people can't afford to buy the necessities. And I think we really undervalue how big a threat inflation is to every single working American and every retired American. And that's one of the things that your committee should be really heavily focused on.
You know, during your speakership, Congress enacted welfare reforms that encouraged adults receiving assistance to seek or find gainful employment. Similarly, the 1997 Taxpayer Relief Act established a child tax credit. In the American Rescue Plan Act, Democrats dismantled the child tax credit. They removed work requirements and turned the credit into a monthly stipend. As a consequence, the labor force recovered just 1.6 million workers in 2021. After the Democrat child tax credit plan went away, 1.7 million Americans returned to the labor force in just the first 2 months. Just the first 2 months of 2022. What does the success of efforts you helped initiate, as well as the fallout from policies our Democrat colleagues initiated, tell us about what sort of policies are and are not successful in helping families? And why, when enacting these sorts of family supports, did you tie them to income and work?
You know, Art Laffer, the great economist who helped develop supply side economics, always said, you get more of what you pay for, and you get less of what you tax. So if you really want to give people money to do nothing, a lot of people will learn to do nothing. If you really want to tax people because they go to work, a lot of people will learn not to go to work. Again, these are simple lessons of historic fact. It is a fact that if you have, and I think you should go through the entire federal program, and every place where somebody gets money, they should work for it. There's no reason why people who are able-bodied should be indolent and should be handed a check to do nothing or given food stamps to do nothing. And I think it's very important to reestablish a work ethic. When we worked on the welfare reform bill, and again, it was a bipartisan program, President Clinton signed it. And I think people forget that the Clinton-Gingrich reforms, every single one of them was bipartisan. It had to be. You had a Republican Congress, a Democratic president. And when we worked on it, we were very close to the governors, particularly Governor Thompson in Wisconsin and Governor Engler in Michigan, Governor Allen in Virginia. They had been experimenting on limited approvals with getting people to go back to work. And what we did is we looked at a firm called America Works, which is a remarkable firm in New York City, actually created by Mario Cuomo when he was governor. And America Works had a program of helping hardcore unemployed learn the basics. How do you get up in the morning? How do you get dressed? How do you get to the bus stop? All these things that people don't automatically know. Well, we took the lessons of America Works and we applied it to every welfare office in America, became an employment office. And people followed the incentives. You would have a shocking improvement in the economy and a shocking improvement in small business almost overnight by simply requiring that people had to work to get resources from the federal government. It would be that almost instantaneous turnaround.
Mr. Speaker, our Democrat colleagues, they argue their child tax credit plan cut child poverty in half. Yet researchers at the University of Chicago and the University of Notre Dame have determined that child poverty, in fact, declined by just 9% from its peak. But in October 2021 to December 2021, further, the average child poverty rate since the expiration of the monthly child tax credit payments is lower than the average child poverty rate while the monthly payments were in place. So based on your time and work on welfare reform, what do you think is the best way for government to address child poverty?
Well, I think first of all, to rebond the family, to help the mother and father get jobs, to take out all of the anti-family provisions that are in welfare, and to take out the anti-work provisions. The key is to find a way for people to rise so that they never go off a cliff of losing so many government subsidies that it's not worth their while to go to work. If you do that, I'll just close with this. The reason it matters to get people to go to work is in the long run. You want every child to learn that work is legitimate, it's authentic, and it's a key part of their life if they're going to rise and have a better future.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me take a moment of personal privilege and to say to Speaker Gingrich, I don't know if you remember, but you swore me in 1998. My predecessor was Ron Dellums, and you and Ron were very close friends, even though he totally disagreed with you on every issue, but including welfare reform. But it's good to see you, and thank you for being here. A couple of questions I'd like to ask yourself and Dr. Hoynes. I lived in Great Britain for 2 years. I lived in London. Well, I lived outside of London, but my son was born in London. And what I learned then, and this was in the day, was that there was much more support for children and families than in the United States, in Great Britain. Even myself, as someone who was not a citizen of Great Britain, I found it more supportive of myself and my family. And so some other countries, especially in Europe, have more comprehensive policies that support children from birth through early life. What do we see in terms of the differences between the United States and countries with those kinds of systems in terms of long-term economic outcome? And are there any policies that, I'll use Great Britain, for example, but any country in Europe that are more pro-life than ours? Dr. Hoynes, maybe I'll ask you first and then Speaker Gingrich.
Thank you very much, Representative Lee, for that question. So if you would look at my testimony that I submitted in advance of the hearing, you'll see some data to kind of illustrate the point that you make and to show the United Kingdom compared to the United States and also more broadly across many dozens of advanced economies. And what you see from that data is that the United States, as a share of GDP, spends a very small amount on benefits for families with children. I think there's one or two countries that spend less than we do in this comparison of advanced economies. And what you also see is that we have kind of perpetually a much higher rate of child poverty. And interestingly, though not part of your question, this is not true across the board in terms of spending in all categories in the United States. If you look at spending on elders, for example, the United States is kind of on par with other industrialized countries. And in fact, in some cases, spends quite a bit more as a share of GDP, mostly because of our very high health expenditures. So we spend less and we get less. We have higher poverty rates and child poverty rates in particular. And the research that I summarized shows that that has profound implications on the trajectory of that generation of children. And so what we see is greater rates of poverty and greater rates of inequality more generally in our society because of spending less, particularly focused on children, and even more particularly on children of before school years, is where we're really an outlier in terms of less investment in the face of very high rates of return on that investment that we've seen in many studies.
Thank you, Speaker Gingrich. Of course, the pro-life policies that I've experienced in England versus here in the United States.
Well, look, I think the British coming out of World War II did a pretty decent job of organizing entry-level healthcare. And you know, for example, I favor community health centers. I favor enabling doctors who are willing to provide all sorts of services voluntarily. There are a number of voluntary clinics around the country that do a good job. What the British couldn't do was manage both that entry level and then manage the more sophisticated and more difficult problems, so that, for example, women who have breast cancer have a much worse future in Britain than they do in the United States. But I do think there are things you can learn. One of the challenges is cultural. How do we get everybody, if you make it available, how do we get people to take advantage of it? And there was a center in Memphis that was totally free, but couldn't get people to come to it. It didn't fit who they were and how they operated and what they wanted to do. So part of this is understanding we have a very deep challenge in America with cultures of poverty, which is now compounded because they're also becoming cultures of drug use and cultures of suicide. I mean, I think it's a huge problem for this country.
As well as racism and racial inequities.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I might have a second question when we finish. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. And now welcome our newest member, Mr. Moore, and recognize him for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair and Ranking Member, for the very warm welcome. I appreciate that. I'm thrilled to be here for my first committee, Budget Committee meeting. And as mentioned too, I am the father of 4 boys, 9 and under. And so my wife and I are very much in the thick of early childhood development. And I want to just give an example to try to put a little bit of context to what we're talking about today. While I would never admit to which one is my favorite, especially on the congressional record, we have put an enormous amount of extra special attention on Winnie. Winnie is a 6-year-old with autism spectrum disorder, and he just finished his first year of kindergarten at a traditional kindergarten where he was allowed to have an aide come in and help. And we have been giving him gobs and gobs of resources from the very start when we recognized that there was going to be a developmental delay. And I come from one of the most conservative states in the nation. I come from the state with the strongest economy, and I come from a state that gets criticized for what are they doing, not spending enough on education in early childhood. We have been so fortunate to take advantage of many programs that my state, my very conservative state, does have a part of. And I laud and I'm very appreciative of our state legislature for always being able to balance where we would, how we handle this. I look at the success that we've had, and we're very excited about the future for what holds for Winnie. But the point that I'm trying to make, and I want to do it in the most sincere way possible, is that there are times where we need flexible spending in our family finances to be able to go and address issues that come up. And my siblings, none of them had this issue. None of them had a child that had these particular types of needs. They had other issues. We have to have flexible spending and an opportunity, when you want to call it disposable income, whatever you want to call it. We need to be able to have that in our individual families. So we empower families. I love what Speaker Gingrich said about empowering families over empowering government. And that's the part that I'm most frustrated with. I voted against the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan because for that exact reason is I don't believe that it empowers families and it empowers us to be able to make decisions. And as I look at what the outcomes have come in the last 18 months, where we have seen record inflation and decreasing real wages, that will limit families' ability to address some of these issues. And again, I'm admitting that there are many programs that my very conservative state has put in place that have helped, and I've been a part of it. but there is a balance here, and we cannot allow our economy to get to a point where we're having runaway inflation that will limit individual families being able to go and address this issue. Speaker Gingrich, you've already talked about how family finances, federal deficit spending, and everything can be a problem. There's two other things that I wanted to get a chance to ask you about, and that's the work requirements and welfare programs, and then the budget process in Congress. And I just wanted to give the time to you for the next couple minutes. If you have any thoughts, I'm a big fan of what you accomplished when you were in the late 90s and what you're able to do in a bipartisan way. I put together a task force that provides some of these recommendations. Would you offer any other ideas to this group on fixing our budget process and or addressing and how important is the work requirement into welfare programs?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for your very personal testimony, which I found very moving. And I think it's important that people realize that we're not just talking about abstract public policy, but we're talking about real families and real children and real situations. And I think you helped with that comment. I'll just say two quick things in the time we have available. One, and this will shock some of you, but I actually believe in an approach of listen, learn, help, and lead. I mean, if I could get any one thing across the Congress, because remember, every single reform that we passed in 4 years had to be signed by Bill Clinton. We had to be bipartisan. And every single reform Bill Clinton was going to get to sign had to be passed by a Republican Congress. So we had a vested interest in listening to each other. And I would start there. There is more than enough ground, I think, for people to find an opportunity to be positive and creative in a way that's good for America. Second, I really do believe, and I can't say this too strongly, you need to look at balancing the federal budget as a big project, not a series of little projects. The corruption opportunity is so staggering. There is so much out there. And that money could all be either going back to the taxpayer as a tax cut, or it could be going to new programs, or there could be some way to divide it. But the fact that the Congress doesn't take seriously the theft, literally theft of billions and billions of dollars, I think is a major lost opportunity, both in funding programs that matter and in getting back towards the balance. So thank you for your question.
Thank you, Chair. You're back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the opportunity to participate. I just want to make one quick comment about the problem of inflation. This is a global problem. They expect, if you look at the Eurozone, they have worse inflation than we do. They expect 11% inflation in Great Britain by October. There's nothing we did here in America to create global inflation. It exists, and we have to deal with it. What we're doing is a three-prong approach. One, putting money into people's pockets so that we can they can pay the higher prices. We did that, the rescue plan with the stimulus checks, earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, and others. We're improving the supply chain to get more goods to the shelves to make sure they're not stuck out in the Long Beach harbor. We've made investments in Hampton Roads Harbor as ports. The Hampton Roads ports have gotten funds from the infrastructure bill, and we're putting more people to work and training them, childcare, job training to make sure that we can be more productive. We're dealing with inflation. My fear is that if we do some of the things that are suggested to squeeze the American economy with much higher interest rates, we may put us into a recession and still not do anything about the global inflation. Dr. Black, you mentioned that WIC was based on science. You suggested like there was some other way to make decisions on WIC. Can you just make a quick comment about why science is important and not slogans and sound bites?
Thank you. Thank you, Representative. I appreciate your question. Yes, WIC is very clearly based on science. It is based on the science that we know that during their pregnancy, women need to have healthy food and they need to have their health care looked after. And the benefit of that is not only to the women, but it's to the infant. And we know that infants who are born healthy, who are born at term, who are born at an appropriate birth weight, have the best chance to not only live during the first year of life, but they have the best chance to prosper and live throughout life. So WIC is absolutely.
And these benefits are not just healthcare costs, but also education and other measurable outcomes?
Thank you. Absolutely. They are comprehensive. So they benefit children's education, and actually followed through, you can find benefits that prevent non-communicable diseases, as WIC helps children build healthy habits. So the healthy habits include dietary habits, and for those who go to early childcare, they are also physical activity habits. The habits that we build very early in life stay with us, and that's why WIC is laser focused on those very early years.
Thank you. Mr. Malik, one of the problems with some of these good cost-effective programs is that the costs are paid by one agency, like a city doing a city jobs program, and the benefits accrued to other agencies like the State Department of Corrections and lower costs. Do you have a way of dealing with that?
Thank you, Congressman. I think your broader point is worth echoing, which is we know we have a lot of fantastic educational and health benefits that drive from investments in early child care and early education. The thing that it's worth stating for the record here is that we all benefit from the investments in education, as we know, through our longstanding public education system. And when those services are extended to more families with babies, toddlers, and preschoolers, there are even compounding and rippling benefits through the economy in the near term, in terms of parents being able to work, go and get further education, pursue opportunities that they might not have if they didn't have the stable, reliable childcare. But there's also, of course, long-term, long-run benefits for those kids as they are more likely to graduate high school, go on to college, have less contact with the criminal justice system.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm trying to get another comment in quickly about the deficit because the speaker has talked about the importance of the deficit. The fact is that every Democratic administration since Kennedy has improved the deficit. By the end of their administration, every Republican president has left office with a worse deficit situation. And my recollection on the Clinton-Gingrich budget was that when the vote was taken, when Marjorie Margolis-Wyszynski cast the 218th vote, the Republicans waved bye-bye Marjorie, did not produce a single Republican vote on that bill. And in fact, the 2 years later, when the bill, when Speaker became Speaker, the government was shut down because the President Clinton didn't want to dismantle his budget. And when the bipartisan vote finally occurred, the deficit had essentially been eliminated. So I think we need to talk about the importance of the deficit, to give credit where credit is due. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I hate to cut off the other chairman, but I have to do it. Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I have a lot of comments here. First of all, the chairman says that over the last 3 decades, things have gotten worse. I'll point out that at least in Wisconsin in the last 3 decades, the age at which children are cared for by the state continually drops. And I'm assuming, half-day 5-year-old kindergarten was the norm 30 years ago. Now it's like, I think 4-year-old is the norm. And I'm sure we have more childcare subsidies as well. So if the answer is more early childhood, these test scores of American education would not have been falling for the last 3 decades. Secondly, I'm somewhat stunned that we have 3 experts here talking about what we can do to help children in their early childhood years, and they don't address any of their speaking to the fact that the easiest way to stay out of poverty is to encourage marriage. Instead, they cite the same old programs, which, if anything, discourage marriage, because things like the earned income tax credit, if you're not married, you're going to get more money. I don't think that is a particularly good thing. I think the best thing to do would be to change the culture and go back to the pre-Great Society years, when presumably we had better test scores and we would have better outcomes for the children. Lately, we have politicians standing with groups like Black Lives Matter, and I realize it's a diverse group, but their founders claim they want to get rid of the traditional nuclear family. And I think you should, rather than support that type of thinking, I think you would do a better job of spending some of your time encouraging people to get involved in traditional families. Third, the chairman here talks about the poor moms who are sitting at home and wishing they would go to work. That is not true. I'm looking at the study that you cite, and if you group in things like women who don't have kids at home, many of them want to work. But despite the overwhelming social pressure to answer the questions that I wish I was working, the majority of women with children under age 18 would prefer to be homemakers. They would prefer to stay at home. And that is and that's children under age 18. I wonder what would happen if Gallup included that question for children under age 5. Then I bet it'd be overwhelmingly the women would rather be staying at home. And I will point out that I think whenever you do questioning Gallup or other things, there is a temptation to act politically correctly. I'm sure if you were a mom asked these questions living in, say, a hotbed of intolerance like Berkeley, California, or Madison, Wisconsin, the pressure must be overwhelming to say, I would rather work. But despite the pressure, the societal pressure to say I'd rather be working, the majority of women still say they would rather be at home. Next, if we look at studies on preschool, look at the famous Brookings Institution study, a liberal group. They could find no discernible benefit for Head Start. Now, of course, being a liberal group, I think they felt the answer is to spend more money on Head Start, or things to that degree, but that's interesting. But you can also look at the studies put out by a conservative group like Heritage Foundation that would indicate that early childhood is not a benefit. Next thing I'd point out is that when you increase these early childhood programs, sometimes what you do is you take children away from a family type situation in which they're cared for by the aunt or by the grandparents, and again, ship them to strangers. I don't think there's anything wrong with having children raised by a grandparent or an aunt or something like that, but that is inevitably what will happen as you flood more money into these so-called free childcare programs. And I guess my final comment, I in general don't quote communists, but I guess that's it. We'll give back my final 45 seconds to my chairman, but there's some.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. We appreciate that. Now recognize the gentlewoman from the U.S. Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you and the ranking member for convening this hearing. I wanted to ask some questions because I do believe that supporting children and making the appropriate investment yields outcomes that are economic and financial in nature for our country, saves us money over a protracted period of time. In the Virgin Islands, according to Kids Count, which is a survey that's done, childhood poverty in my district of the U.S. Virgin Islands is approximately 30%, which is significantly higher than the national average of 16%. I wanted to ask the witnesses that are here, in their expert opinion and their learned opinion, what policy should the federal government be pursuing to tackle childhood poverty in areas with extremely high rates such as the U.S. Virgin Islands? Are there mechanisms that the federal government can use to jumpstart and eliminate child poverty in those areas to bring it at least in parity with the rest of the United States? Anyone?
I'd be happy to take that on. If you'll indulge me a very small personal note, I happen to have a connection to St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands, so I'm delighted to be able to have this,
as we call it.
Exactly. So it's great to see you.
Thank you.
Representative Plaskett. So the numbers for the U.S. Virgin Islands and your district, that is very high and much higher than the national average. And your point that we have demonstrated evidence that spending more in terms of these programs targeted at children are going to yield important returns in the long run that'll then transform those poverty rates in the next generation to be lower. That's the operating premise that comes out of what is now an extensive body of research. So if I were to start to say, what should we do more of in order to get that 30% down? I think I would turn to what we saw in 2021, and I would be interested to see what the projections are for the reductions in child poverty in your district from the expansion of the child tax credit in 2021. Because what we saw from that expansion was essentially the largest reduction in child poverty. The numbers for 2021 are not out yet, so we're still in the world of doing more predictions than having the full census data, which will be released in the fall. But what we know from the available evidence thus far is that that reduction in poverty is greater than anything, any single act, any single policy change that we've engaged in the United States since we started measuring poverty in the early 1960s. And to get back to some of the comments that have been raised in the earlier conversation, a critical thing about the child tax credit, it ticks a couple of boxes that have come up. Representative Moore talked about the importance of flexible spending. The child tax credit provided resources that were very flexible for families. Number two, what we know about, I'm an economist. We study both the benefits of programs and the costs of programs, and we talk about trade-offs of benefits and costs. And when we provide assistance to families, we need to quantify, we need to build into those costs the effects that they might have on employment and earnings decisions. And the powerful thing about the 2021 expansion of the child tax credit is it made work versus non-work on parity. If you were working, you got the child tax credit. If your hours were cut, you still got the child tax credit. Until your earnings were, up to way beyond the median in the United States, you still got the child tax credit. That is the power of a safety net.
Thank you. Another question I had related to children is with regard to schools. In July, the Virgin Islands Board of Education released a report on schools in the Virgin Islands, which found significant environmental, health, and fire deficiencies. Indeed, the Virgin Islands Fire Service even stated that numerous schools are so unfit for the purpose that they should be demolished. Can any of the witnesses speak to the impact of unsafe, unhealthy, or unfit schools have on childhood education or child development, and what the protracted outcome of that is on society?
Thank you very much for your question. Children benefit by having an environment that is safe, that is predictable. Having a school, as you described, would be frightening not only to children, but also to their families. Families look to schools to protect children, to help children learn, and to ensure their safety. So investing not only in the structure of schools, but the hygienic aspect of schools, along with ensuring that the teachers are supported in schools. It's unhealthy for teachers to be surrounded by an environment that is not respectful. So I would think that a more comprehensive approach to education that looked at the environment, that looked at the security, looked at the safety, looked at the support for teachers, and of course had a curriculum that was designed for the children would ensure the confidence in the education system for all involved. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the ability to question the witnesses and for this really important discussion on investing in our future through our children.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and Speaker Gingrich. It's good to have you in committee again, even if it's only virtually. And we always appreciate what you have to say. And this time you did not disappoint. You gave me a new term, suicide by hubris. And I think that's one that we all ought to incorporate into our discussion. I'm struck by the fact that it is probably too late to do anything to save this Congress. I hope it is not too late to do anything to save this administration. But Speaker Gingrich gives us some important food for thought as we approach the next Congress that, if nothing else, we shouldn't be wasting money. Now, Dr. Hoynes has pointed out the earned income tax credit is a value. You lower the incidence of low birth weight infants with the earned income tax credit. You improve test scores of children and the increased probability of someone completing high school. All of those are good things. But then according to the IRS's own website, 21 to 26% of EITC payments are improper payments. Now, that's not to say fraud, but improper payments. And they even suggest that maybe it's the complexity of filing for EITC that leads to those improper payments. But I guess, Mr. Speaker, my question to you is, do you think in the next Congress, the type of oversight from this budget committee to really drill down on where these improper payments are and why they are occurring? And look, we could boost the EITC budget by 25% if we just paid for things that actually mattered.
Well, Congressman Burgess, first of all, thank you. It's always good to be with you, and I appreciate the question. Let me go back to what I thought was the very heartfelt questions of the representative from the Virgin Islands, because if you have a community of poverty, it's very hard to help the children get out of poverty, since by the time they become adults, they're going to be still trapped in a community of poverty. And we know that there are steps you can take that can dramatically transform it, but it has to be holistic. It has to approach the safety issue. It has to approach infrastructure. It has to approach the kind of incentives needed to create jobs so that a community of poverty ends up as a community of opportunity. Now, let me apply that to your question. I'm fascinated that California lost $20 billion in unemployment compensation, apparently from the district attorney who I interviewed for one of my podcasts, largely to criminals in the California prisons using the California prison computers for identity theft. Now, north of California, Washington State lost about $600 million, apparently largely to Nigerians who were operating out of places like Lagos, using, again, identity theft. If you take every requirement to make the Virgin Islands a flourishing paradise in the Caribbean, it's probably less than 10% of what was stolen by criminals in California, let alone across the whole country. So I would hope that the process of looking at fraud, theft, which by the way really affects Medicaid and Medicare in some states, the process of looking at why does the system not work correctly, I would hope this would be a major part of this committee's assignment next year. And I think you'll be shocked at how much money you can liberate and you can take away from criminals and return back to the purposes for either to cut taxes or to pay for necessary programs.
So, Mr. Speaker, when you had the Center for Health Transformation, one of your scholars there, Jim Froeg, had written what I consider the basic book that every member of Congress ought to become familiar with, Stop Paying the Crooks, which dealt with the inappropriate, improper payments in Medicaid. And I think you're exactly right. And the oversight functions of, yes, our committees on energy and commerce, but in particular our budget committees. And pay attention to the Chief Financial Officers Act that was passed back in 1990. We need to use those parameters to be able to stop paying for things that we shouldn't pay for and allow those dollars to be used for what they were intended, what Congress passed the laws in the first place. So I thank the speaker for participating in our hearing, and look forward to working with you next year when we actually have a chance to perhaps positively affect some of these things.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for this very important hearing. And certainly it is a pleasure to be able to see the former speaker, who I had the privilege of working with. And as the speaker knows, we certainly had disagreements, but it is appropriate to show respect. And to the other witnesses that are here, thank you for your presence as well. We understand that this hearing is important because we're examining the practical impact of our budgetary actions on children and families, who must always remain a top priority in everything that the Congress does. The Supreme Court's recent ruling in Dobbs amplifies the urgency of these issues. The court and my colleagues across the aisle who boast of being pro-life must now show Americans and support Americans through every stage of life. Well, let me wake them up. In the year 2020, the United States Census released an official supplemental poverty measure report showing that 11.6 million American children were living in poverty. These 11.6 million children constituted roughly 16% of American children. There is no seeming desire among my friends on the other side of the aisle to make real on their commitment and thought about our children. And so it begs the question as to whether or not we can even have a serious discussion. I want to make sure that we do have a serious discussion. And for that reason, I want to pose these questions to our witnesses that we have here today. Let me ask Dr. Hoynes about this whole idea of how we can save children when we embrace family support programs in our budget, including childcare, school nutrition programs, and how much investment that really turns out into, because we're actually investing, if you will, in a future life for these children. Dr. Hoynes, can you help us with that?
Yes, thank you very much for this important question. So what we know, which has now really emerged in a decade of broad-based research in social science, is that providing more food and nutrition programs, both from WIC, as Dr. Black has talked about, as well as through SNAP, which I've studied extensively, as well as school meals, that these programs are extremely important in building a foundation for future economic and health success among our children. And in particular, the work that I've done on SNAP shows that the years in particular up to age 5, perhaps because school meals kick in once kids are in kindergarten, we don't really know for sure, but that those years are particularly sensitive years for generating a good foundation for children, and a good foundation that yields a broad range of improved outcomes in their adulthood. And these outcomes take some time to emerge. You know, we've got a little bit of data when kids are in school on test scores, but really the data starts to become much more available once we have completed education, high school, college going, labor market connections, as well as kind of health and adulthood. So that is sort of the basic formula that we see emerging from the research on food and nutrition programs. We also find that programs that are a bit less targeted, not in kind, so the earned income tax credit, as well as some evidence on the available.
Thank you, Doctor. Yeah. I'd like to pursue that with our other witnesses, Dr. Black. Thank you so very much. We know that there are millions of Americans who face food insecurity every day. Dr. Black, you deal with nutritious food, but I also want you to stretch a little bit to give the impact of the child tax credit that the American Rescue Plan provided a lifeline during the pandemic, when really there was a mountain of unemployment, frustration, depression, what to do with our children. Can you just quickly respond to the importance of fighting against food insecurity? Remember the backdrop of President Reagan, who made ketchup a vegetable. Can you quickly do that? I know our time is short. Doctor?
Yes, thank you. You have raised, I appreciate the question. It's such an important issue. Food insecurity beats at the really heart of American children. What families do in order to assuage hunger is that they give children low-cost food that is very low in vitamins and minerals and very, very unhealthy for children. So these are foods like, without naming a product, things like noodles. So they fill you up, but they eat away at your at your health. I'm part of a group called Children's Health Watch that studies food insecurity and strategies to reduce food insecurity throughout the country. This is a major, major problem in our country that during a time of early brain development that we really cannot afford not to invest. The cost of not investing in these children is something we will all as a country pay for. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I'm glad we're on the side of investing in our children. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Speaker Gingrich, for joining us. I would like you to take my whole 5 minutes and just tell us everything we're doing wrong in Congress and everything you would do differently if you were still the Speaker. And I'm only half kidding, so I'll give you a few moments to expound upon that, but thank you for joining us. You know, we have spent, as you know better than anybody, trillions of dollars over the last 60 years in the name of the great war on poverty, with very little to show for it in terms of tangible results in making a difference in the lives of those some would purport to desire to help. And this is coming from someone who I grew up on food stamps. I grew up with free school lunch back when you were one of few in your school, and I grew up in an inner city school system where I was one of the few kids on school lunch. I grew up with groceries left on my porch from other families who took a benevolent interest in my family. I grew up without a card, had to walk everywhere. You know, our family did, had to work and pay my own way through school. But what we have done, as you know, with all of this spending is very little to show for it other than hiring bureaucrats, growing the national debt, expanding the culture of dependency. But a shining moment for us, as you well know, was the 1996 welfare reform law that you spearheaded, which replaced the open-ended aid to families with dependent children with the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF. Can you tell us about the work on that and the results of that? Can you hear me, Mr. Speaker?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity. Welfare reform began in 1965 when then candidate Ronald Reagan, running for governor, first came up with the idea that we ought to return to a work-oriented welfare system. There were various experiments, the efforts to get things done. It was very, very hard to get it through the Congress as it was organized prior to 1994. But there were occasional opportunities offered, exemptions offered by mostly HHS, Health and Human Services, and people like Tommy Thompson in Wisconsin, and John Engler in Michigan, and George Allen in Virginia began to take advantage of that, and they began to notice that if you emphasized work and built your program around work, that you had all sorts of second and third order effects. At the same time, we went and studied, I personally went to New York and studied America Works, which was a long-term recovery program sponsored by Mario Cuomo in the 80s, and which had developed a very specific program for taking people who were very long-term welfare recipients and basically taking them by the hand for 6 months to a year until they thoroughly understood the work ethic, thoroughly understood how to go to work, et cetera. Because there are a lot of complexities that those of us who grow up in a work-oriented family learn from showing up on time to dressing correctly, to making sure you're accurate in giving change. I mean, all sorts of stuff. And so the America Works model, and we took the lessons learned at the state level. We actually asked the states to send us their top welfare people who had been running the programs. And then we worked with President Clinton, and we gradually hammered out a bill which basically got about half the Democrats. I think it was split like 98 yes and 98 no.
Would that we could do that today?
Well, I think you can. You know, they didn't vote because they liked me. They voted because when they went back home, people back home said, yeah, that's what I want. Well, every study we've done, we run a project called the American Majority Project, which you can see at AmericanMajorityProject.com. And the work ethic is very, very high value for the American people. So a program that reestablished the work ethic would be important. And that has a psychological impact on the children. I mean, if your parents do nothing all day, if they sit around waiting for the next government check to come in, if they are totally dependent, you are learning a set of habits that cripple you for the rest of your life. And so it's very important, one, to go through the system and take out everything which is anti-marriage, every single incentive that encourages people not to get married or not to stay married. And two, to take out everything which discourages work. You make those two changes, and in a matter of a very short time, you'll have a much healthier country, and you'll have children who are growing up in much healthier environments.
Thank you so much. That was the case for me. I was taught to work hard and the value of work. And you're right, the work ethic and supporting intact family units, great deterrent to poverty. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing before the committee. I'm also glad that we're here to emphasize the overwhelming differences in outcomes that early childhood interventions can create. And I want to start by saying Americans are hardworking. I really take offense to the narrative that some are trying to frame Americans as somehow not hardworking. This last 2 years has shown that the American people are resilient. They don't give up. They overcome great obstacles, and they are focused on returning to work. I represent Nevada's 4th congressional district, which was one of the most hard-hit sectors with hospitality, tourism, and my folks are going back to work. But unfortunately, childcare is one of the barriers that many people, particularly women and families, indicate they need more affordable, quality childcare. I haven't heard a whole lot of emphasis around what we need to have around quality. So I would like to talk about how these are investments. We spent a lot of time on how much expenditures are being made. Childcare is an investment. And yeah, I voted for the American Rescue Plan because it supported funding for essential support, including childcare. Now, when the Republicans were in charge and the former administration was in charge, they chose to give tax cuts to the very wealthy. That was their choice. Our choice was to invest in the American people during a pandemic. Dr. Hoynes, you made the case better than anyone that we see benefits not only paid back over the long term, but they are paid back to society with significant interest. Child poverty affects all of us, regardless of our income. Even by conservative efforts, we are leaving $800 billion a year of economic activity on the table by allowing children to continue to languish below the poverty line. So since you discussed how the expanded child tax credit more than pays for itself in increased economic activity, including to the private sector, that was money that was reinvested back into local small businesses, which we desperately support. Would you be able to explain how some of the non-direct costs society incurs by not dealing with child poverty, such as lower potential future earnings or shortened life expectancy?
Thank you for that question. So we know that providing more resources when children are young translates to a broad set of improvements in adulthood. And I think the key across the studies, there's one outcome that shows up in almost every study, and that is human capital, educational attainment. And educational attainment is like the turnkey to getting higher earnings in the labor market, which has, of course, direct effects on the family, on the child, but as you point out, pays back returns to the society at large. Higher earnings mean more tax payments. Higher earnings mean less transfer payments. And so there's very direct effects that show improvements for the child and the family, but also important dividends, if you will, that pays back to the society in the long run. And I think really the one thing that we see very consistently is human capital.
Human capital, investing in the human needs that all of us have, and childcare is one of those needs. Now, in 2020, the adult to child ratio in Nevada preschools was 1 to 15, which means our teachers have to look after 50% more children than what is recommended. This includes many of our brave service members who are stationed in my district. This story is far too common. Just ask some of the local constituents in Tonopah, Nevada, where the situation has become so dire that they have no remaining licensed childcare providers. It's one of the reasons that I submitted a community project funding for a child development center in that rural community. Mr. Malik, could you discuss how childcare deserts are detrimental to child development and what resources could be made available to reduce the prevalence of childcare deserts? Yes, thank you, Congressman. Childcare deserts are unfortunately ubiquitous throughout this country. The number one source of revenue for a childcare business or childcare provider is parental fees. And that kind of limits what you can pay your teachers based on what are safe and appropriate, developmentally appropriate ratios of teachers to children. It is not safe to have one teacher trying to watch over 10 or 12 toddlers. If you've ever been around 3 toddlers, you know that that's pushing it. So what we need are the result is lower and middle income communities are vastly undersupplied in the types of the variety of childcare options that we want to see. We want families to have lots of choices, have lots of ways to meet their preferences and to find quality options. And unfortunately, as I said in my opening statement, the numbers don't work for childcare in America. We need some kind of public investment for something that many people consider a public good in the way that we talk about public education.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know my time has expired. That's the type of investment I'm willing to make. I wish my colleagues would do the same.
Gentleman's time has expired. I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jacobs, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists and Speaker Gingrich for being here today. This is a very critical issue for the future of our nation and our young people. I served for over 7 years on the Buffalo School Board, so kind of a lot of my tone here will be with that experience, but certainly it highlighted for me the significance of what you're talking about today. I can't recall the exact statistics, but I do remember our kindergartners and our pre-K kids coming in with a significant number of them already needing remedial help because of the fact that they had oral language deficiencies and the other basic building blocks that are required for them to be able to learn to read. And so this is a very important issue. Mr. Malik, I just wanted to ask one question. Your testimony about that the U.S. invests a smaller percentage of GDP in childcare and early education. Is that federal funding or in total funding?
Sorry, I believe that's from combined federal, state, and local funding.
Because I know we are different than many other places in terms of the majority of our education funding comes from state and local governments, or mostly local governments. And I go back to my Buffalo experience that I'm really disinclined to just look at expenditures as a barometer because the Buffalo Public School System spends an awful lot of money with not very impressive results. We spend right now probably about $30,000 per student, and that's the public governmental funding of it. That doesn't touch on any of the additional outside money in terms of nonprofit charitable work, which we have an incredible amount. I remember vividly when I first came on the Buffalo School Board, we had recruited a new superintendent who came from Ohio. After a couple of weeks, he briefed us on his impression of the school district, and he said, you know, you really aren't running a school district, you're running a jobs program for adults that happens to educate every once in a while. So I think it's very, very important on how we spend the money, that we responsibly spend the money. And I just wanted to leave time for Speaker Gingrich, if you could comment a little bit more on what Congressman Good talked about. We talk about the indicators here, the difference that certain expenditures, certain programs have on outcomes. You talk a lot, Mr. Speaker, on incentivizing family formation, removing the disincentives to family formation. From your research, could you just talk a little bit about specifically the impact of not having a two-parent household, the impact of fatherlessness in communities, and if we could work towards strengthening our families and two-parent households, what your research and experience has shown that the difference that would have on outcomes and alleviating long-term cyclical poverty?
Thank you for the question. I must say, hearing from somebody in the Buffalo area automatically for me brings back memories of Jack Kemp, who was probably the greatest Republican advocate of rethinking how we help the poor and how we get people to be prosperous of anybody I ever served with. So I'm delighted to have that question. A couple of quick comments. One, if the government would simply measure outcomes rather than inputs, you'd have a much better sense of what's working and what's not working, and you'd have some really troubling problems, because there are whole programs that don't work. It's not a function of money. They just don't work. And there I would say I helped launch A Nation at Risk in 1983, which was the Reagan report on education, which said, if a foreign power did to our children what we're doing to them, we would consider it an act of war. And it hasn't improved. You look at the Baltimore school system. I can't speak to Buffalo, but I spent a lot of time looking at the Baltimore school system. It's tragic how much we spend and how little we get done, and how the children are the ones who suffer. So I think that's a key part of this. I would also say, if you look at Marvin Olasky's great book, The Tragedy of American Compassion, and Charles Murray's book, Losing Ground, you'll get the framework of everything you need to know. If you want to make sure somebody does not end up in poverty, have them complete high school, have them not get married until they're out of high school, and have them get a first job. They will almost guaranteed they will never be in poverty. Notice the changes in culture that occurs, and the fact that we're now talking about personal responsibility and personal engagement. So thank you very much for the question.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Eradicating lead in water is one of the most critical ways that we can improve the health outcomes of our children, who, when even exposed to low levels of lead, can have permanent damage to their central and peripheral nervous systems, learning disabilities, shorter stature, impaired hearing, and impaired formation and function of blood cells. This can cause lower IQ, decreased ability to pay attention, underperformance in school. An estimated 3.6 million American homes with at least one child have significant lead hazards. 1 in 40 children, 1 in 40 have lead levels that are considered unsafe. Each lead exposed child costs an estimated $5,600 in medical and special education services. And that's just for the time that they're a child. We're not even talking about the lost productivity of these poor kids throughout their entire lives. Now, Democrats worked to pass the bipartisan infrastructure deal, which included more than about $40 billion to support safe drinking water, including about $20 billion for safe drinking water, $15 billion for dedicated funding to replace lead pipes. Think about that. $15 billion just to replace the pipes that are still full of lead in our country. $12 billion to ensure clean water for communities. $1.8 billion to protect regional waters. $135 million for additional water improvements. Now, Speaker Gingrich, you were in the House for 20 years, House leadership for 10 years, the Speaker of the House for 4 years. Why didn't you do anything to decrease the amount of lead children are exposed to in their water?
Look, I think that's a great question. And I think most of us didn't realize until Flint, Michigan, what a disaster so many of our infrastructure systems have been and how much they need to be replaced. And I think the information you just laid out was very powerful. And I agree with you. And I think one of the reasons I'm for measuring outcomes rather than inputs, and one of the reasons I think that we need to look, for example, at blocking corruption and returning that money to infrastructure, we clearly have public health infrastructure requirements that are real. I think you'll also find, if you go back, that we invested a lot in trying to improve things. And in fact, without our investments, the situation will be worse today. But I agree with your concern. And I think lead is one of those things that is so obvious and so clear that starting with the disaster in Flint, it's surprising to me, we have not been more effective in identifying every hot spot that needs to be fixed and having some practical, efficient way, and I want to emphasize, practical, efficient way of getting it done, not bureaucratic, not unionized work rules, not whatever triples the cost. But this is a public health crisis, and you're exactly right. And I thought your statement was very powerful.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Boebert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's just come out swinging. Democrats in Congress are a joke. Leftist policies have led to an invasion at our southern border, massive inflation, historically high gas prices, and so much more. I serve on the Natural Resources Committee. We can't even talk about energy production in the Natural Resource Committee when we have jurisdiction over this self-imposed crisis from the Biden regime and frankly from the Natural Resource Committee for not taking up issues on that. But what do these politicians turn to when they realize November is looking like a massive red wave? They turn to the children. Let's ignore our failed policies and talk about spending more money, and let's say it's for children so people will be okay with it. This is disingenuous, and the American people see right through this. You want to support Americans' children? How about we reduce spending and curb inflation so our families can afford new shoes for when our children go to school? Let's implement school choice. Teach our children to love America. Teach them our values that we were founded on instead of squashing those and lying about them. Let's empower parents instead of calling them domestic terrorists when they show up and have an opinion or a question about what their child is being taught in our schools. But this hearing is about Democrats' desire to spend more money that we don't have. Frankly, just printing money at this point. Let's take a look at the track record of how their spending agenda has worked so far. 9.1% inflation, and one of my most favorite, seemingly prophetic publications, the Babylon Bee, says that that decimal point may be in the wrong place. It might be actually 91% inflation. Energy is at 60.6% inflation, and fuel oil is at 98.5% inflation. The average American family with 2 working parents has lost $6,800 in annual income since Joe Biden took office. And yet, all leftists on this committee and throughout Congress want to do is spend money and pretend to be handcuffed for attention. Speaker Gingrich, I have a question for you. Under your leadership, Congress passed welfare reform, the first balanced budget amendment in a generation, and the first tax cut in 16 years. Under Pelosi and Joe Biden, inflation and interest rates are up while wages are down. Now, Mr. Speaker, do you believe that these Democrat policies will make it more or less likely for our children and families who will experience a recession in the near future?
Well, look, I think it's pretty clear that, and it's sort of an irony in terms of this particular hearing, that the very policies of inflation, extraordinarily high gasoline and diesel fuel prices, rising cost of food, all of these policies are going to drive more children into poverty. The objective fact is that the policies that the Biden, Pelosi, Schumer team have followed don't work. I just recently wrote a book called Defeating Big Government Socialism, in which I outlined that these aren't accidents. These are policies. They believe in high gasoline prices. They believe in high diesel fuel prices, high heating oil prices. They oppose the American oil industry and the American gas industry. That's why Biden won't go to Texas or Oklahoma or your state of Colorado or Western Pennsylvania, but he will go to Saudi Arabia. It's crazy. So if you really want to deal with children in poverty, get the economy growing, stop the inflation, cut taxes, make sure people have take-home pay. I mean, you're exactly right. I thought actually you're being pretty darn effective just now. This is an impossible situation for the left to deal with. And I can tell you, having lived through the Carter years and watched Carter's presidency disintegrate under the combination of a recession and inflation and energy crisis, Reagan beat Carter by the biggest electoral vote margin of any incumbent president in modern history. And in the process, we won the Senate for the first time since 1954. This year, I think the American people are going to walk in that ballot box and they're going to say, I really want more of this. And if you really want to care about children, you have to make sure that children's families have enough money that they can afford to have a decent life, that they can afford to do the things necessary. And frankly, it's disappointing to have a hearing like this and not confront how much government itself has been the problem. But thank you for asking me.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, my time has expired. Thank you so much.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Smith. It's an interesting time to be here today to talk about this topic. And I tell you what, this topic is very important. When you talk about access to childcare, where parents are struggling right now to find a place to bring their child, to have parents, as we just talked about, where they don't have the dollars to pay for childcare. In Iowa, this is real. I mean, this is extremely real. And the problem is that we need workers in Iowa. We desperately need workers in Iowa. But what's happening is we have a parent staying at home because they can't afford childcare. So they got to make a decision. And the decision is also this. They're sitting around the kitchen table trying to figure out how they're going to make ends meet. Pay childcare? How do I pay for groceries? How do I pay for gas in the car to get from point A to point B? And then we have this situation that is not going to end. Inflation. And the family, the parents are saying, wait a minute, how do I look to the future when groceries are going up, when the things that I need to buy are going up, how I need to put gas in my vehicle, and there's no end in sight. And now we have this bill. We have the Democrats continuing to talk about more spending and more spending. They're going to only cripple the problem that is occurring. Now, the solution to inflation is raising your interest rate. We saw that the Federal Reserve has done that. So they increased 75 basis points. Was it now 5-6 weeks ago? And now they're talking about it again, right? They're talking about it again, saying, hey, we have to raise another 75 basis points or maybe even a full point. So my question, and I'd like to ask Speaker Gingrich about this. So when you start increasing your interest rate, that has a direct effect on the family budget. How does that have a direct effect? Because if they have a car payment, if they have a house payment, and it's a variable interest rate, all of a sudden they're going to be paying more. But I want to know from the Speaker, when we have interest rates that are going to continue to rise, what happens to our $30 trillion of debt? So we have $30 trillion of debt and we have interest rates increasing. That means the long-term and short-term and long-term interest rates or I should say bond yields are going to go up. How does that affect the American household? Speaker Gingrich, if I could ask you that.
Well, thank you for putting your finger on, I think, one of the great hidden threats in Washington, and where the Budget Committee ought to be demanding that the Congressional Budget Office lay out what this is going to do to the federal budget. As the largest debt holder in the world, the U.S. government, if we end up with very high interest rates on the federal debt, it is going to eat up the budget. People have not looked at it. This is part of why we were so adamant in the 90s about balancing the federal budget, which we did for 4 straight years with Bill Clinton on a bipartisan basis. But we had a program, cut regulations, cut taxes. All of the supply side economics that Ronald Reagan implemented in the 80s turned out to work. We went back and got them to work again. Inflation came down, interest rates came down, jobs grew, children came out of poverty because their parents were coming out of poverty. So when you put your finger on a huge issue, I don't know the exact numbers. I had my folks at Gingrich 360 the other week run sort of a run, but we're not the budget office. We don't have their data. But I think if we get a significant increase in interest rates in the Federal Reserve, the effect of that on the federal budget is going to be staggering, and it may well mean that I'm not certain of this, so double check me, but it may well mean with a high enough interest rate that you're actually going to end up with the debt payment being equal to the defense budget. Now that is insane. If that was happening to an individual or that was happening to a business, you would counsel them, they need to get their spending under control and they need to get their debt down. But I want to commend you. You put your finger on one of the greatest threats that's about to hit us. And I think we are totally unprepared in Washington for thinking through the implications of the largest debt holder in the world suddenly deliberately raising interest rates.
Thank you, Speaker. You hit it on the head. That's exactly what I thought. That's how serious and dangerous this is and what we're talking about right now. We've got to help families. We've got to get our inflation under control, but we also have to understand we got to quit spending for our families, for our children. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. And by the way, this Congressional Budget Office does that on a regular basis. They make that estimate at least every 6 months. So that information is pretty widely available. I now yield myself 10 minutes for my questioning. And I'm going to start by saying that it's been fascinating to listen to my Republican colleagues and to Speaker Gingrich when talking about the future of children in this country. And I think we can all stipulate that it would be great if everybody had a job that was well-paying and that they were qualified for and that they enjoyed and that was convenient to do and that they could afford to work in. It would be great if every child grew up in a stable family with 2 parents, whether they're male and female or female and female. That would be a wonderful thing. And we can wish that that were the case, but it's sadly not the case throughout this country. And probably nothing that we could do in this body is going to change the fact that there are going to be millions of children, innocent children who did not choose the circumstances into which they were born, that will be suffering if we don't act and somebody else doesn't act, they're going to be suffering and diminishing their prospects for a future. And when I look at I have a 3-year-old grandson. I have a 1-month-old grandson. They're going to have every opportunity that they could possibly want. But they aren't typical. And when you look a generation or 2 into the future, the American tax base is going to be composed of a lot of children who come from very unfortunate circumstances, very unlucky circumstances. And that's really what we're talking about today. We're talking about those children, again, who don't choose the circumstances into which they were born, who are going to need some help from somewhere, whose families most frequently can't provide it, and who represent not just a challenge for our society and our government, but also a huge opportunity. We're not going to convince people to procreate more than they're doing now. As a matter of fact, I heard a news story today that because of the Dobbs decision that the incidence of sterilization among women is dramatically rising. Parents are choosing not to have children. So where is that tax base going to come from? We need to make sure that every child born in this country or who immigrates to this country has every opportunity to thrive. I want to give Mr. Malik an opportunity. I'm going to comment on some other things, but Mr. Grothman talked about Head Start, a Brookings report on Head Start, and that seems to be the one report that has been brought up, at least for the last 10 to 15 years, to undermine efforts to have universal early childhood education in the country. Would you care to comment on that study and generally on the benefits of early childhood education?
Yes, I don't have in front of me the specific report that Congressman Grothman was referring to. I do know that there was a Brookings AEI consensus report around pre-K and early education, including mentions of Head Start, that found a wide range of benefits to children, to their families. It's important to note that Head Start doesn't just provide educational services, but it promotes, it decreases children's food insecurity, promotes healthier eating habits and physical activity. There are a variety of family services that are attached to Head Start that also have tremendous benefits to the family. There are also intergenerational benefits to Head Start. There are studies that have found that the children of Head Start recipients actually do better than those of similar background, but whose parents weren't able to access Head Start.
Thank you. One of the things, we all come to this job and this role with different experiences and from very different areas. And I know many ranking members' district is a lot different than my district. My district is 30 miles across. It is totally urban. We have one school system. It has almost 100,000 kids in it. In that school system, more than 50% of those kids are on free or reduced lunch. 50% of them at least change schools at least once during the school year because they've been shuffled around between family members or they're homeless and so forth. And one of the things that was probably one of the most impactful things I heard once was I was at a luncheon on a Friday, and I was sitting next to our school superintendent at the time, and it had snowed, they had just called off school on Friday. And she said, "You don't know how much it breaks my heart to have to cancel school on Friday, because that's when kids get their blessings in a backpack. They take home their food, and that will be all they eat all weekend." This is the type of situation for which WIC and SNAP are critical, don't you think, Dr. Black?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. They certainly are critical.
And I could go on at length about the American Rescue Plan, and I've defended it a number of times before this committee. My name's on it as the author, even though I didn't write one word of it. But it came through our committee, so it says Mr. Yarmouth on it, and I'm very proud of that. And I think we have to go back to that time, and because there's no question that there were incredible problems in the implementation of the American Rescue Plan. But what were we facing? We were facing a crisis that hit us almost spontaneously. Nobody saw it coming. All of a sudden, 20 million people are out of work. Businesses are closing right and left. The economy basically shut down. We faced, unfortunately, blame it on whoever, going back a long time, we were not prepared for a pandemic. So we're learning as we go along. People were justifiably critical, but at the time, but the fact is we didn't know how bad it was going to be. We shut down everything. We didn't know that kids were less vulnerable, more vulnerable. We knew that if they caught the disease, they would give it to their colleagues would take it home, and it would be disastrous. So when Mr. Gingrich says things like, we committed all this child abuse over the last 2 years, we did not commit child abuse. That's an absurd statement. Forgive me, Speaker Gingrich. We were trying to do the best we could to maintain the safety and health of our kids and our families. And in my particular state, and the comments have been made about unemployment. And yeah, there was a lot of money that went to people who probably didn't warrant it. In my state, unemployment applications went from about 200 a week to several thousand a week. That Department of Unemployment in Kentucky was not equipped to handle the deluge of unemployment applications that they were faced with. So yeah, they're trying to get money out the door. That's what we were all trying to do. Because we were facing an economy that was on the verge of collapse. So we were trying to get money to businesses. We were trying to get money to state and local governments. We were trying to shore up a sinking ship. And yeah, in those circumstances, which were unique, at least in my lifetime, we were doing the best we could. And hopefully we'll learn lessons about that. And one thing I will agree with Speaker Gingrich on, and some of my Republican colleagues, we rarely think about the implementation of the programs that we put into place. We need to be much better at that. And I stressed with the administration when we were trying to do the Build Back Better plan that, and talking about childcare, that we can't just say we're going to spend $300 billion on childcare unless we think about how we're going to build the capacity to do it. In my district, my school superintendent said, if we have universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds, something that I am passionately in favor of, that we would need to hire 400 new teachers and build 2 new schools. We're already 200 teachers short in our existing classrooms. Where are those teachers going to come from? But meanwhile, we would hold out a promise to people who say, oh God, next month I'm going to get affordable childcare, and it wouldn't happen. So we need to be thinking about that much more. And so I think Speaker Gingrich might agree with me on that point. But so much of this returns to what I see as a total difference in perspective, that some people believe that in kind of a Darwinian theory that everybody can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and that's not our party. The Democratic Party believes government can be a force for good, and that in a capitalistic society where there are invariably winners and losers that don't necessarily have anything to do with who works harder or who tries harder. It's nice to talk about the late 1990s when there was the internet boom and the economy was sailing, but what that internet boom did was for the next 20 years made it impossible for a lot of people to find work, because a lot of jobs disappeared because of it and continue to disappear, and people are not prepared for that. So we can have great discussions about this, but in the general economic situation, but I think what we're talking about today is how can we best ensure that the children of this country, the ones who, again, have no decision in, first of all, being born, and secondly, how they're living, get the most support so that they can become productive members of society and have the kind of life that we want for our own kids and everybody else. So with that, I'm going to yield back, but I'm going to ask for some things to be submitted into the record. There's been some discussion today claiming that work requirements make children better off. In fact, CBO recently found that work requirements inflict unnecessary suffering and do little to actually boost employment or children's well-being. I ask unanimous consent to enter the report from CBO on work requirements into the record. Without objection, so ordered. This hearing has also highlighted the various ways that more investments in children make them better off across the course of their lives. I ask unanimous consent to enter a letter from the Children's Budget Coalition into the record. Without objection, so ordered. We received a letter from over 1,000 law enforcement officers highlighting how important affordable, high-quality childcare and pre-K are to crime reduction. I ask unanimous consent to enter a letter from Council for a Strong America into the record. Without objection, so ordered. And I ask unanimous consent to enter a letter from Child Care Aware into the record. Without objection, so ordered. So with that, I thank the witnesses again for their responses. Thank you, Speaker Gingrich, for joining us remotely. And without any further business. This hearing is adjourned.